All right, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to our discussion on pacifism. I am Chris Polk. I'm joined by Abby Cleckner and Jacob Daniel from Daniel 3, Obeying God Over the State. And this was kind of Jacob's idea, so if it all goes bad, we'll blame him. I got pulled into this, I think, by Craig to say, maybe I should just, because I can't really on this in the affirmative or the negative. So I'm kind of interested to see how you guys go back and forth and maybe sprinkle a little of my own thoughts in there. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start by, because I think we might need to define pacifism.
Yes. Yep.
Let's start there, because I'm sure that word's going to have 17 different meanings to 17 different people. So Jacob, why don't you start there and try to give us a definition?
Sure. So pacifism is probably something that it would be better to describe. It's a philosophy of sorts, and there's probably different levels and types of pacifism, just like, we're anarchists, and we are probably all familiar that there's different flavors and types of anarchists. But the general guiding principle of pacifism, I would say, is just that it's a philosophy of nonviolence, and you believe that it is immoral to use any type of violence or force against anyone in any situation. That would be kind of the non-textbook amateur hour definition I would give off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's different variants. And I'm glad you suggested defining it from the get-go, because I wanted to do that. And also I wanted to make sure I asked Abby kind of what pacifism means specifically to her, because I don't want to just be debating a straw man of her positions.
Yeah, so I would agree with that definition, and I would say I've only arrived at full pacifism in the last 3 years or so, of being like, even self-defense.
You have your black belt of pacifism?
Yes, exactly. It's taken many years of training, but I've arrived. But getting across because I think that's the last big hump of even self-defense and defense of your kids in a personal situation. I would say, I don't know if we want to get into that yet, but I'm not super into condemning people really for anything, but it's if you do use violence in those situations, I get it, I sympathize. I just think that we should be trying to get to a better place where we have better solutions.
So so we kind of agree on the general definition of what pacifism is. I guess the only other thing I thought that would be prudent to do before we get into the back and forth would be, to ask you some questions just to kind of get, because again, I want to make sure I'm not just kind of, I don't know if you remember that, Jordan Peterson and that person debate, so what you're saying is, so I want to avoid that. I don't want to be getting into spending the first 30 minutes just kind of going, oh no, I don't believe that at all. So we should just make sure that we know what each other believes. Because like you said, when we were talking and setting this up, to a lot of people, my beliefs would even be called pacifism. Right. So would you say, from the Christian worldview, adding the Christian worldview into say that it is sinful to use any type of defensive force, or would you say that it's just not preferable and that you bring more glory to God, or you are honoring the teachings of Jesus more consistently when you voluntarily choose to abstain from using defensive force?
Yeah, I would say the second, but I think I would say that about anything. I'm very much on everything's permissible, but not everything's beneficial. Okay. I don't think there's black and white rules for anything really, but you have to see in every situation what is the most honoring and the most loving choice to make. So,
okay,
is there a subjective perspective here where this discussion is quite different in the United States than it is in a third world country that's ravaged by war, because the statistical probability of somebody breaking in my house is so infinitely low. I travel for a living, and so I'm in all these different states, and I lock my doors at night, but I never lay down in the sleeper of my truck and think, I hope nobody breaks in my truck in the middle of the night. So that is one consideration that I think has to be at least addressed when you have different societies and different levels of basic peace. I mean, even in all the chaos and turmoil that's going on in the world right now, we still have about 95% peace, so
Mhm.
I think that blurs the lines and clouds the water just a little bit in this discussion, because, if I got bombs dropping around me, I got the chance of soldiers going to blow the door. It's a whole lot different from a crackhead trying to come take my TV and a soldier about to kick my door down and shoot me or kidnap my kids or, that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, I agree. That's fair. And I guess where if I were to venture a guess as to where Abby and other pacifists, and maybe specifically Christian pacifists, are worried, like they're not maybe so much like you might make a differentiation between me saying I want to defend my family and the United States military committing genocide in Yemen. But what you might say is your concern is that, kind of the slippery slope argument that you don't get to genocide in Yemen overnight. There's a series of compromises of, this type of force is okay, and then this type of force is okay, and you're wanting to be as consistent as possible with what is ethical and when force is permissible, so that you're not setting up kind of like these precedents that will later be abused by people to, commit, these, like you're talking about, Chris, the really blatant forms of violence that, we all agree are unethical and inconsistent with the Christian worldview.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And also, I would say not even just the slippery slope argument, but I feel like if you can come to a peaceful solution in any situation, that's more beneficial. Even just one-on-one or defending your family, which honestly, I think everybody agrees on that, like, yeah, if it's possible, let's have a peaceful solution where nobody gets hurt. But it's just degrees to whether we believe that's possible or not.
Sure, and I agree with that sentiment on its face, but I do think that we have to be careful when we're talking about peace being a virtue, because there are certainly, and I think you would agree with this, that there are certainly situations that exist in the world, relationships and maybe socioeconomic climates where things are tranquil and peaceful, but there is a presence of major injustice and major immoralities being committed. Like, a wife might be in an abusive relationship and being peaceful, but, the peace in that sense might not be the most virtuous situation, or like, a submissive slave, so to speak. That's not exactly something where we're going, yeah, good. No, you're not resisting your slave master, and that's what we want from you. And it's like, there's a little bit of a discernment there that would be my only slight pushback against that.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I liked that you used that word, tranquil. Like, I definitely think there's a difference between things being tranquil and things being peaceful. If somebody is being oppressed, that's not peace.
Right. So you would want, like,
there's no violence involved.
So there's peace where there's like tranquility, and that might be good, but isn't always. But then there's like a peace that's like a harmony between people, and that would be the type of peace that we're shooting for. Where so, and I would agree with that. Insofar, and that's what the Bible says, I think. Insofar as it depends on you, be it peace and harmony with everyone around you. And I certainly agree with that. I'm not someone who thinks that violence is a good way to solve problems. I think that, even as we get into this, in the situations where I think that it's okay to use defensive force, it's not that I think that the outcome from using that defensive force or defensive violence is like a good, but it's like comparatively, this is less bad than the alternatives I was faced with. So I do want to make that distinction. I'm not trying to take the position of violence leads to like good things happening, but rather that like sometimes when you're weighing the options, it's like, well, I'm faced with one crap option and one really really bad option, and that's what you're just trying to minimize the amount of evil done.
So how about one thing I think to consider here is a fist is a weapon, it's force, right? A knife is a force multiplier. A baseball bat is a force multiplier. A gun is a force multiplier. And I think I came to the realization that if I was here in the house and I caught someone coming in, and I have to assume their intentions to do harm, that I would in some way repel that invasion. Okay. Whether or not I use a force multiplier to either match an equal multiplier, that's one thing, to repel an invasion, to address a direct threat, versus they get in and they leave, and then I go bomb their neighborhood and kill everybody there, and that feels like when we get to talking about pacifism and foreign policy, that's pretty much what we have. We can use something like Pearl Harbor or 9/11, the real stories aside, just what they
well,
are.
and that's a very important point, Chris, because and I'm sure we'll get into this again later, but like one of the passages we're probably going to bring up at some point is where Jesus talks about, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then he brings a alternative perspective to that. But to go just to focus on the eye for an eye part, that was a positive step forward from what a lot of human civilization and what kind of our base human nature is and was. Because a lot of times people are so vengeful that they're not looking to just get justice, not looking to just restore what was lost. They're like, oh, well, you took, this much from me. I'm going to take this much from you and ruin your life. And what I mean? Like, so they go above and beyond their response. And so it was like, God kind of had to take that, the people coming out of Egypt who had been, a few generations into slavery and that had a lot of ungodliness in them. He had to kind of, that first step was, listen, like, in terms of justice and civil law, you can only go as far as what is reciprocal to the offense that was directed at you. You can't go above and beyond. And so that is an important concept that is in the Bible, and that is certainly something we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, well, and on that point, I have to now, because I was exposed to the principle, I have to examine the scripture with history, context, and audience, and so when Jesus is talking to them and says, well, you've heard it said, so he's talking about the old covenant, but now I tell you, he's giving them a new way to view God as the Father, because the old covenant sounds like us, our vengeance, our anger, all of our negative emotions are wrapped up in the old. And then Jesus comes in and starts talking about loving your neighbor. And this is something these people have never, they're not about loving their neighbor. They're about, we're our group and we're going to protect our group. And
Sorry, I'll let you finish. I don't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I just, I, we have to take the scripture in context. And one of my favorite teachers is a guy named Jamie Englehart, and he said, there's one interpretation of the Bible. And that one interpretation is the people that were there at the time. What did it mean to them? And then once I understand what it meant to them, then I can understand what it means for me. But I have to start there first. I have to think about what was happening at the time. What were the customs and the things that they were dealing with, and how would they have responded to those words? And then I can say, okay, well, now that I understand how he meant it to them, I can understand how it means to me, because we always drive off in the ditch of Romans 13 without ever going to Romans 12. Someone said one time, well, how do I interpret Romans 13? I'm like, start by reading 1 through 12. Start there. Go from 1 through 12 and then go to 13 and look for the full picture instead of just your old McDonald theology, here a verse, there a verse, everywhere verse, and I'm just going to grab one and run with it.
Well, what's interesting is, and I'm not trying to take away from what Jesus said, that it wasn't important and novel, but, the idea of loving your enemy was not something that only exists in the New Testament. It was in the Old Testament, loving your neighbor. And like, this is some stuff I shared in the group chat before we did this, but like Proverbs 25:21, if your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. Exodus 23:4-5, when you come upon your enemy's ox or donkey, you're supposed to return it. Or if it's like, caught somewhere, help set it free. Leviticus 19:33 and 34, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. The stranger resides with you shall be to you as the native among you. So, there is a lot in the Old Testament. And I think the problem was what Jesus had, why he had to correct people was because, and the whole Sermon on the Mount, I think, was that people had this heart of, like, the law tells me how bad I can be.
Yeah.
And I think what Jesus was trying to tell people was, don't seek to be as bad as you think that I allow you to be, because that just misses the entire, point and the nature of God and the point of the law. What you should seek to do is to be as virtuous as possible. And so that was an important correction.
Really gets to the heart of this discussion, because it can get into so much into, like, well, what if I only is allowed? And it's kind of like, yeah, don't think of it in terms of, like, how close to violence can I get with it still being okay. It's about changing your perspective of not dehumanizing anybody, but seeing even the person who is trying to hurt you as a human being, and trying to kind of reframe your mindset of, what can I do to make this situation, or planning for the future, what can I do to make future situations work out to be peaceful and healing, even for my enemies, rather than increasing the violence. Sure.
And one thing, an important caveat to bring up is that prevention is always better than cure. It's like a really cool saying that I like to bring up, because when you get to the point where, let's say there was a situation where you feel like you have to use violence, like I said before, I don't think the outcome is going to be good no matter what, whether you decide to use defensive force or not. If a good outcome comes from these types of situations, it's by the grace of God. But a lot of times these altercations people get into, sometimes there is no good solution to that problem, but what you have to look at is, was this preventable? Were there steps along the way leading up to this altercation that you could have made different decisions that would have prevented these things from happening in the first place? And so yeah, like, I agree, my arguments against pacifism aren't really, I mean, I'm not even someone who identifies as, like, anti-pacifist. I really am not, like, seeking to justify violence as if, like, that's in my heart and I'm trying to hold on to it. I guess like more my pushback is kind of more where rubber hits the road. because, I have seen many situations in my life, 28 years, where I go, yeah, I don't know if I was in this person's position, how I would not use some type of defensive force. And one thing we might want to get into is what defines violence, because the way I've conceptualized defensive force is that it's kind of separate from violence. To me, violence is sort of like initiating aggression against someone, and self-defense is more of I'm going to use minimal up to reciprocal force necessary to remove or negate the violence that is being initiated against me, to sort of not, and I don't view that as fighting evil with evil. I use it as like, trying to restore yourself back to a position before the evil fell upon you. So, I mean, what's your thoughts on that? What do you think violence means in these contexts?
Yeah, that's something where I feel like I don't have all the answers, and I feel like every situation needs like a nuanced perspective. And I'm not here to like condemn anyone's actions when they were like in fear of their life or in fear of their loved one's life or something like that. I just think, I guess, working toward finding better and better solutions. And if anyone was hurt in that situation, coming at that with like a more mournful perspective, like viewing it as a tragedy rather than like, I think especially a lot of anarchists coming from kind of a more Republican-y background, it's like very much this culture of like, yeah, if someone sets foot on my property, I'm going to blow their brains off, and hooray for you for defending your family and all that.
It's worse than that. I've met people who actually want someone to break into their property. Oh, they're like, I hope someone does. And I'm like, yeah. Why would you? I'm like, why would you even say that? Like, that's just such a, like, why would you want a threat to come into your home? And B, why would you be relishing in the idea of killing a threat? Like, that's just, that is totally foreign to me. And I agree. Like that definitely is a problem. And,
and I think that's really common, and especially like, a lot of us kind of came from that background, and it's kind of hard to like see your way out of that completely. And I think libertarians, non-Christian libertarians in general, are very much like in favor of self-defense and like you have to defend yourself. So I think we have kind of a lot of that baggage that we bring with us. So I think it's not so much about, like, I can't say this equals violence, this doesn't equal violence, but again, that mindset shift of like not rejoicing in these situations, but like viewing them as a tragedy and trying to come up with better solutions. And I think that's what's good for like the people who are in those situations, who maybe ended up, actually maybe saving lives, maybe defending someone, saving someone, but they had to use either lethal force or something like that is a trauma for that person. And I think when we come at it with only cheering them on and like, yeah, you saved lives, good for you, you should be so happy about that, I think it kind of creates a turmoil within them that we're not acknowledging of like, no, this was a tragedy and it was horrible that you had to do that, and let's kind of work together as human beings to find better solutions so it never comes to that. I would say like practical solutions. I mean, I wouldn't view like restraining someone as violence or even maybe pushing them off of you. But beyond that, like every situation takes nuance, and I think all we can ask for is like, let's get to better, more peaceful solutions that are actually healing for both the attacker and the person being attacked.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of that. And, like one of the things I'm working towards in my own life and my own family is, it's like, when I was young, it was like, okay, I have a firearm. If someone breaks into my house, I feel a little bit safer than I did before. Then as you have kids, you start to think, well, I don't really relish the idea of having to go down my stairs in the dark and face an intruder. And then, what can I do to prevent the intruder from getting into my house in the first place? So then you talk about securing your doors better locks, securing your windows, maybe, investing in a security system, alarms and security cameras. And I've heard some people complain, like, oh, that stuff's expensive. And I'm like, yeah, and how many guns do you own? Like 10 or 20? Like, how much did that cost? Like, it's like, yeah, sure, that stuff can cost money, but, so do firearms. Now, I get it. It's like you can have one firearm, and that's maybe a lot cheaper than a, like, fully equipped security system and putting all that stuff on your house. And I'm not judging someone who maybe is in a economic situation where that's tough for them. But I think, that is what our mindset should be. It should be like, I'm trying to prevent these situations from ever arising, rather than relishing the opportunity to, like, because if that's where your heart is, then I think you're wrong. If your heart is, I'm relishing the opportunity to use defensive force, from a Christian perspective, because, like, from a secular ethics perspective of just like libertarian civil law, I can't really condemn that, so to speak. But from a Christian perspective, I don't think I don't think that heart is compatible with the heart of Christ, and that is something I would not support.
So the dictionary definition of the word violence is behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. So intention is a big part of this. Now, I have two boys in this house, a 5-year-old and an 11-year-old. And the 5-year-old is beginning to understand that he can, come running at 27 miles an hour and jump, and he has inadvertently hurt his older brother a time or two. And I've had to set him down and say, listen, there's going to come a day when he is going to knock the hell out of you. And when he does, I'm probably going to say, you had it coming. You pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. And I've told you, keep your hands to yourself. I have given you instruction, and someday he's probably going to knock the crap out of you. And, so, because I'm thinking, what is it, for every action, there's a equal and opposite reaction,
Mm-hmm.
Well, we, especially in America, and unfortunately, especially as Christians, our default is, oh, it's evil. It's just evil. If someone does something that harms another person, the devil made him do it. Had to be, they got their demon possessed. They, we need to pray that demon off of it. And I'm like, okay, but we have to understand that hurting people hurt people.
Yeah.
So when I see, especially for some reason over the last couple of weeks, it's really the stuff about pedophiles and, and we ought to string them up and burn them and beat them. And I'm like, y'all, listen, normal people don't engage in that kind of behavior. They just don't, I'm not going to excuse their behavior, and there's consequences for their behavior, but I can't let my default be ignore a victim that is creating more victims, because this is the guy, the initial victim is the guy that Jesus would have gone to. And like you said before, fix the problem. Yes, protect the children. Absolutely protect the children. But we'll use a word like predator so easily. Oh, well, they're predators and we got to get them and shoot them and kill them and beat them and burn them. But Christ would have protected the children, absolutely. But our default button being, oh, well, there is someone with a mental illness. There's someone with a predilection of a sexual nature toward children. So no questions asked, just kill them. And I think that's where this pacifism is less about allowing for certain kinds of violence, and it's more in the Christian, the Jesus view, and more about loving people where they are. The guy that goes to break in to the or goes to rob the gas station, you can go ahead and assign to him or her, well, he's just too lazy to work, so he's going to go rob the gas station. There's probably a couple of those. But there are people in dire situations, maybe of their own doing, they probably engage in some sort of stupid behavior that got them there, okay? But if they just want the money, you can get more money. You got insurance. That's what it's for. So when I hear a pacifist discussion and say, well, if it's the TV they want, just give them the TV. Well, I work for that TV. That TV's mine. And get insurance. Get insurance. Go get you another TV. Go get you another car. Go get you $500, whatever it is.
Or if it's a really big deal, like, let's say they take your car or something, that something that you need to live, something that's very valuable. There are legal recourses that you can take that don't involve like just showing up to that person's house with a gun to take your car or TV back. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like that's Absolutely. That's not going to help the situation at all. I would say, insurance might be a last resort if you try going through some kind of legal recourse. And by legal recourse, I'm not, again, I'm not saying it doesn't have to be from the state. You can have private court systems and all that. So right. I don't want all the anarchists going, he said court legal system. No, so I just need to make that caveat. This is a really, there's so many things I could say to what you just said. I guess where I would go. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was thinking along the same lines of when you were talking earlier. That it really is, it's about being more proactive than reactive. And like you said, I can get better locks, I can lock my windows, I can get a security system. I think even beyond that, the same way that we would look to end the violence of the state is the same way that we would look to end the violence of just regular people, which is pouring into our community, serving each other. Like,
how we raise our kids.
Yeah, the way we raise our kids and volunteering with other kids in the community so that they have strong adults.
Because what's better? Let's say for argument's sake that there was a pedophile kidnapped a child, and to rescue that child you had to use some kind of force and you killed the pedophile. And let's just say, for argument's sake, there was no other way to save that child and we feel bad about it, but we had to use force. Well, what would be better comparatively? Is that the best case scenario for how we deal with pedophiles? Or, like I said earlier, what about prevention? What about, how did the pedophile become a pedophile? Because, unless someone can show me some kind of, genetic marker that makes someone a pedophile, which, that doesn't exist, that person came to that behavior. Now, listen, I'm not trying to say they're not responsible for their actions, but again, it's no one just, no one does these things without other influences. And a lot of these evil, if you're going to take the stance that maybe, because I know there's varying views on human depravity and how much our sinful nature affects us. But if we were going to, again, for argument's sake, take the worst version that humans are born and without any social conditioning, we would just be rapists and murderers. Let's just, for arguments, I don't believe that, but let's just take that stance. Well, obviously not everyone's rapists and murderers because they get brought up by, good parenting, and there's a culture around them that discourages those things. And when people fall through the cracks and become pedophiles, rapists, and murderers, there's got to be things in their upbringing that led to them not being conditioned to behave in the ways that everyone else did. So we should be looking to prevent these things rather than just focusing on what we do once it happens. It's kind of like cancer. Chemotherapy is like a poison. Like, if you got cancer and you're on chemo and radiation, like you feel like hell more from the treatment sometimes than the cancer. But it's just like you've hit that point where the only thing you can do is like those are the only options on the table for treating cancer. I mean, some cancers you can treat with diet, but it just depends on what we're talking about. But what's better than treating an illness once it's presented is preventing it from happening in the first place. And yeah, like that would be our response to, what you brought up, Chris. Like that was like where I was going. And Abby went the same direction. It's just like, yeah, we should not just be sitting here relishing the opportunity to go around and shoot evil people. We should be, primarily talking about how we can advance society, raise our kids to have the values that we believe are important. And yeah, like for the people that were raised in bad situations and that are out there hurting people, we need to have some kind of, legal system, preferably not the state, preferably something through the market. I know, Abby, you're big into like Austrian economics, so am I, and I'm sure you've looked into private law and all that. So yeah, like, I prefer there to be market solutions for how to handle criminal activity, and those should be employing the least amount of force possible. That is to me what the ideal thing is. And this whole, like, you and I aren't really finding a whole lot to disagree on, and this is why I wanted to start out by asking, what kind of pacifist you are, because some pacifists that I've talked to, both on the Christian anarchist pages we're on and elsewhere, have more strict views that are just like, oh, well, if you were even to like forcefully incarcerate someone who's doing harm, that's, not in line with true pacifism. So it's just like, because I do feel like as long as we're here on Earth and there are going to be, human beings that behave in harmful ways, we need to have some kind of response to like deal with the people doing harm. But I don't think the solution is to just, everyone goes around with their AR-15s, pointed at each other all the time. That's not helpful.
Right.
Well, I think there's an issue of eschatology here, because I think there are people who will take a position like this and have to go to an extreme because they're still trying to keep up with the law. They're still trying to check off all the boxes and say, oh, well, I'm on a constant battle here to maintain my righteousness. And I'm going, no, Jesus took care of that. Your righteousness is done. It's finished. You're good. You're covered. So I don't even really, as I talk about pacifism, violence, nonviolence, I'm not looking at this as something that's going to earn me brownie points in heaven, have something to do with my salvation, eternal security, because I know that if I do step over that line and I kill someone accidentally or on purpose, I am still covered by that sacrifice. So, there again, I don't have to say, oh, hey man, I'm good. I'm going to kill everybody, because somebody said grace of God a minute ago, and I just made this note. The grace of God is us. It comes from us. We are the conduit of that grace. Yes. So if we won't give ourselves that grace, then we don't have anything to extend to the pedophile, the drug addict, the whatever person engaged in the destructive behavior, whether they're destroying themselves or they're destroying someone else. If I don't have the grace in me, then I cannot extend that to them.
Yeah, and I agree. And insofar as someone who professes Christ makes excuses for like, well, I'm saved, so I can go do whatever, I would question that person's understanding and actual, connection and relationship to Christ. Because not to say that they, I'm not talking about salvation. It might be they're very young, very immature in their walk with Christ, and they need to be, not attacked, but someone, a pastor or, someone at their church, a family member or friend should come alongside them and provide some gentle correction. But like we talked about earlier, like, the Sermon on the Mount is one of my favorite passages, because it just shows that God's heart is not Yes, there is grace, but the grace is there to allow you to operate to be as good as you can be. And that's kind of a response to the love of Jesus. The love of Jesus transforms us. The Holy Spirit transforms us to where we want to do good. And we try to do as good as possible, not just, look at where the line is and, kind of like, like a dog on a leash, like pulling to the maximum amount the leash is allowed. We're called to walk side by side with Christ, not to be pulling as hard as we can in the opposite direction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what it is in every situation, we need to look for how are we bringing the kingdom into this situation. Like Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and all these things will be given to you also. So I think when we're looking at self-defense, it's like, how am I bringing the kingdom into this situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I definitely agree that, I believe that pacifism should be, and I think it often is for people, it should be the societal preference, because you don't want the opposite. Like you can't universalize responding violently to offenses, because you just, that does lead you to the whole, like, what an eye for an eye makes everyone blind. It's like, that kind of system doesn't work. You do want pacifism to kind of be what your preference is towards. My only pushback against it is some people who take, I guess, a more very trying to come up with the right word, a very like ideologically possessed position to where they would be condemning people who act defensively in certain situations, and kind of going off of things Jesus said in certain verses that I think show a preference towards pacifism, obviously, but that aren't like actual commands. Like there is nowhere actually where Jesus, I think, explicitly says self-defense is immoral. Never, ever, ever defend yourself from, what I mean? And and that might be some people might say that's a cop-out because there's a lot of things Jesus doesn't explicitly say. But I'm just saying, like, without that explicit command, I'm going to say, yeah, there's definitely we want to lean and prefer peaceful solutions, and that should be our heart. I do think maybe they're not very common in terms of the grand scheme of things. Like not every person will live their life and have something like this happen to them. But, there are people that do end up in either really abusive relationships or, like I have family members who are women who have been sexually assaulted. And, it's like I've asked some, not Abby, but I've asked other pacifists before. I'm like, what do you tell a woman who is being like, kidnapped and by a sexual predator, and like what is she allowed to do? And it's just like, my heart in that my heart in that moment is not kill the person that kidnapped her. It's just like I want to save that person who's being attacked. And if I'm in a situation where I have to at least use some force, whether it's grabbing or pushing or and to save that person, I'm going to do it. But if the guy's bigger than me and I can't fight him off, or if it's a woman trying to protect herself and she's not physically capable of warding off her attacker, but she has some kind of weapon, whether it be pepper spray or a knife or a gun, I'm not going to sit there and either preemptively or after the fact condemn her for using force to ward off an attacker, because I don't see that in the teachings of Jesus. I don't see a condemnation of people who are resisting like an actual attack of evil on them. It's one thing, like the turn your cheek thing is like, well, yeah, like if someone just slaps you and you can walk away from it, walk away from it. Like your life's not in danger. If someone insults you or pushes you at the bar, just walk it off. You might be angry, but to strike back in that moment, I do think is going against what Jesus taught. And I think that's sinful behavior. But that's different than your life or your wife's life or your daughter's life or your son's life or your neighbor's life is in actual physical danger. I think there's a difference between those two.
Well, there's also something to be considered, that there are at least anecdotal evidence that in the case of abusive relationships, that people have tried to get in between the abuser and the victim and ended up getting shot or killed. If you have an abuser and you victim, well, because of the the complicated nature of that relationship, you try to get in the middle of that, you can end up being harmed yourself by the victim. I mean, there's been people that have been injured and killed by the victim of domestic violence because you sometimes you have to let people work it out on their own, and of course, it starts with our children, teaching my daughter now, don't ever accept that kind of behavior. And then, but if she ends up in it somehow, I've got to figure out how to come beside her without getting in the middle. And because it's really not my place to interfere that way and say, okay, well, you're a victim of domestic violence. I'm going to kidnap you. Now you're not being abused anymore. I
think it really depends on what we're talking about. I mean, again, I'm going off personal anecdotes, but I have a family member, I'm not going to name their relationship with me or their names, obviously, who was tied up and prostituted out against her will when in her marriage by her husband. If I had knowledge of that going on, like that was like actively happening, especially, yeah, I'm probably showing up and putting an end to it. I don't know. That's just me. Like, I can't see someone like telling me, like, let's say like it was like a family member in the same household or a neighbor that said like, oh my God, I just like saw this happening and like, I trusted their word. I wouldn't take that knowledge, chew on it and go, oh, well, I'm going to pray for them and I'll talk to her tomorrow. And like, no, I'm going to show up there and end that what's going on, because that's just like, wickedly evil. And my conscience would not allow me to sit there and do nothing. Now, should I go in and just, walk up to her husband and shoot him in the face? That's probably not the correct response either. This is one of those situations, like I said, where there really is no perfect response. No matter what you do, there's going to be pros and cons to it. The end result is tough because evil and sin, it taints things. You can't, in this fallen world, we're really not going to, of our own accord, come to situations where evil has been done and respond in any fashion that's going to bring a result where it's like, 100% true justice and true peace and healing have been brought. Like, that only comes from God and true justice from some of these atrocities. But while that's true, that doesn't mean that we should do nothing while those and I know that's not the pacifist position. I'm not trying to say that pacifists say sit back and do nothing. But I do think there are some situations where I don't see a way of, stopping the evil that's going on without some measure of force. And I think the people that use the force should be trained to do it. Like, you shouldn't show up with a head full of steam and just start popping caps off at people. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not even saying you need a gun. Like, listen, like, if you want to get trained in martial arts and kind of study and how to disarm people and, kind of peacefully put them in positions of being like, disabled. I don't know if there's actual ways to do that. Like, I haven't studied martial arts myself, but if you can find ways to resolve conflicts with force without shooting someone, all the better. But, again, like it's one thing to sit here in my basement and hypothesize different situations that could be solved without force or without some kind of weapon. But, when the rubber hits the road, I have seen situations in my life just because of just unfortunately the circumstances that have happened around me where, I'm just like in the moment. Now listen, in like long term, of course, my heart is that even as mad as I was at that family member's husband for doing what he did, I still eventually got to the place of like, my heart for him is that he would come to know Christ and that he would be healed, that he would repent. And like I talked about earlier, I'm sure probably some messed up things happened in his life that led him to being the type of man he is. But those conversations and that, like, I want to see this person healed, has to kind of come after you stop the harm that's being done in the moment, in my opinion.
And I think what you said a few minutes ago about, like, your heart is towards pacifism, trying to find the peaceful solution wherever it's possible, and that as, like, society, that's what we should be geared to. I think that's all I would ask for, is that just that, we're thinking about it, and you're not like, if you have daughters, like, yeah, there's crazy stuff that might happen, here's a gun, good luck, but trying to come up with more options than just that. And then, yeah, as a woman, I would say also, I would never condemn anyone for what they had done. I think in the heat of the moment, and you're, like, panicking and that fight or flight sets in, and not having been in that situation myself, I'm not going to come down on somebody. But again, I would recognize the tragedy in the situation and want to come alongside them to recognize, like, you hurt somebody too. And then just, like, in general, what would be better solutions to those kind of things. And then I would also say, I think for everybody, it's important to be strong and be in good shape. Like, that's never a bad idea. And then
don't walk alone after midnight in a dangerous part of the city. It's like, yeah, absolutely. Right. Like,
and it's like with your relative's situation, like, I don't know her, and I don't want this to sound like, victim blaming or anything like that, but I'm sure there were a lot of things that happened that before it got to the point, it's not like they had a happy marriage that was wonderful, and then all of a sudden one day he tied her up and that started happening.
Unfortunately, a lot of what happened was her coming to the pastor with the slow escalation, and the pastor just saying that she had to stay with him. And I know that's not something either of you would say to her, but unfortunately, I'm sure you're aware of that. There are pastors in certain churches that have abused some of those teachings in the Bible of, that God hates divorce, and so and
pastors. I think that's a huge issue in the church in general.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about, personal defense, degrees of, what acceptable violence. And I think we should take an opportunity to make as many people upset as a foreign policy.
Can I say two things before we go?
Go ahead.
Speaking of making people as upset as we can. Well, before I get to that, I'll just say what you were saying about your kids. Like, I have 3 boys, so I'm, like, breaking up fights on a regular basis. And I think that comes in with having your heart geared towards pacifism too. If you're approaching it like, well, boys will be boys and they're going to get in fist fights and oh well, or if you're using that opportunity to be like, because all the time it happens that they're just wrestling and playing around, and then it goes too far and somebody gets actually hurt, and then he has to give him payback. So I think having those conversations of, like, no, before, you're mad, before you give payback, you need to take a breath and be like, am I escalating this situation or am I de-escalating this situation? Am I seeking to have a good relationship with my brother, or am I seeking to get vengeance? And like, taking that breath to see where your heart is. I think in raising kids, it's important to drive home that message for a more peaceful world. But the thing that I wanted to say that I think will probably ruffle some feathers is that I view violent defense very much like in the way I view abortion, in that I would say if somebody gets an abortion, I'm going to, while I recognize, like, the tragedy in that situation, I'm not going to condemn them because I'm not in that situation. And especially with kind of our culture of, like, well, babies can ruin your life and you really, abortions are healthcare. And being that it's, like, a very scary situation to be in. And I think back to the thing about how the church treats women, of like, if you are pregnant and not an ideal situation, like people are going to judge you pretty harshly. And I think for a lot of young Christian teenage girls who find themselves pregnant, it's a lot easier to just pretend like it never happened than to have to confront your whole church's judgment on you. So it's very similar to me, where I think like rather than like condemning the person who's in that situation, even though it's tragic, we need to come up with solutions that stop those things from happening in the first place.
My firstborn is a girl. She's 3 years older than her brother. And when he was about, 3, he comes in the room. She hit me. I said, "Did you deserve it?" He said, "Yes." So, I knew how that was going. You know what I mean? I just knew. And he didn't miss a beat. Did you deserve it? Oh, yeah, absolutely. I am becoming more curious, and I've done just a little bit of digging to try to find an answer to this. But I started wondering about were there pacifists during the American Revolution? Because I think we just want to assume that it was everybody in the colonies going, "Hell yeah, brother, let's get that king."
It actually wasn't like that at all.
And so you had those for the king and you had those against the king, but there also had to be the people that were never talked about, and those were the ones that stood back. I made the comment the other day, I think it was in a post, and I said, look, in this current situation in 2020, if y'all start killing each other, I'm out. I'm not participating in whatever stupidity that y'all come up with. So if you start killing each other, have at it. But I'm not getting involved. And with war, with statism, man, people start those allegiances and they start I don't know if this makes sense, but I'm going to try it real quick. So we've had recently, just the last couple of days, we've had a group of individuals that come out and said one thing, right, about the current situation. Here's some people that have said, we've used this product and we're good with it. And then you have another group of people that say, oh, no, that's terrible. If you're on team B, you automatically cannot accept the other team, because now you're saying, well, wait a minute, but my team could be wrong. Your allegiance is so complete at the at that allegiance. So, you get the red, white, and blue running through your veins, and
it's like sports, but worse, because instead of throwing a football, there's bombs being thrown.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you guys do, but as an anarchist, I've come to this place where I can observe politics like I would observe an auto race or a football game. Like I can say, I see the strategy that guy is using to try to get ahead of the other one. And the response is, oh, so you're that guy now. And I'm like, no, I didn't say I was rooting for him. I'm just saying that I can see the strategy that they are employing. I can't believe you're a supporter. I'm not a supporter. I'm just saying I see what's happening. And so with Orange Man Bad now, if you look at something that he does and you say, oh, okay, I think I see what he's doing there. Oh my God, you're a Trump supporter. Okay.
So it's so crazy. It's like you can't, it's like I'm an anarchist. So obviously I'm not a fan of Trump, but if I don't spend every waking moment of my life besides breathing saying how evil Trump is, I must be a Trump supporter.
Yeah. So this issue of foreign policy and pacifism, which I think is probably what most people relate that word pacifism to. Because guys, unfortunately, I'm not on your team anymore. And once I began to see the gospel in a new light, for God so loved the world, that's everybody in it, every man, woman, and child, of every race, of every faith, of every ethnicity, of every sexuality, of every gender, It's all of them. I don't know
I thought
what
it said
part.
I thought it said America. That's what my Bible says.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know what part of all you didn't understand. So when I then, because of Jesus, well, now I've placed humanity on these people. They're not just insert slur here. They're people. They're sons of God. They have a place in the kingdom. They may not realize it, but they do. They may not be of the understanding that they have a place in the kingdom, but they absolutely have a place in the kingdom. And boy, it makes me a lot harder. It makes it a lot harder for me to send the B-52s over there to wipe them out, because now I see them as sons of God and brothers and sisters in the kingdom. So do you think that this is do you have to take this pacifism and put it in a different category rather than the stuff that we talked about before?
No, I think or this is weird because before we get into that, now I will loosely call myself somewhat of a pacifist insofar as Abby and I basically agree. But this is going to be like where some anarchists say that if you support business owners, you're not a real anarchist. But yeah, like I don't think that the idea that you should choose the least violent means of response possible to aggression and nonviolent as a preference. I don't see how that doesn't scale up to foreign policy while states exist, and ultimately if we lived in Ancapistan or whatever you want to call it. And you just, let's say, groups of people, cities having disputes, or if there was a free society bordering a nation state, whatever situation there is. I mean, it's just, you just scale it up over groups of people, I think. I mean, I don't think ethics and Christian principles change at, if they do, let me know, what's the amount of people where it changes? Is it 20 people? Is it 500? Is it 300 million? Let me know where that line is so I can fact check that, please.
I think there's maybe a Tolstoy quote that says exactly that. I'm not sure that it's Tolstoy, but how many people does it change from murder to totally an okay thing?
Right.
Yeah, I think war has to be our biggest issue to speak out against, of oh my gosh, the death and destruction, and the fact that it's so praised in our culture for people to join the military. I think if we can speak out to keep kids out of the military, that would be huge. And I think not even just foreign wars, but if you look back at the Civil War, that's one of those things that in general, Americans are well, we had to have that war. It ended slavery, and Abraham Lincoln is a hero. And it's well, we were the only country in the whole world who needed a war to end slavery.
Exactly.
So it's not it's impossible to accomplish these things through nonviolent means.
I forget where I heard it before, where someone was brought that up, and they were see, in Europe, basically what the government did was they just kind of bought the slaves, and they stopped. They purchased the slaves from the slave owners and then set them free. They were just recompensating the slave owners for the property they lost. And then they stopped and before that they stopped catching slaves when they escaped. And someone said, well, that's kind of immoral, isn't it? To buy slaves to get their freedom. Is it do we need 600,000 people killed to free slaves?
Right.
Only in America, I guess.
Right. Or even if you just look at slavery probably wouldn't have lasted as long as it did if it weren't for the government.
That's true.
Putting in practice those laws to hold it up, and the slave trade in general.
The Fugitive Slave Act,
Yeah.
I mean, they if you try, which Tom Woods is like a gateway drug, when I began to study real American history and looked at that period from about 1798 up to the 1850s, before Lincoln, it was all about preserving the Union. They didn't give a damn about the slaves. They wanted to preserve the Union. Well, if you try to say, well, yeah, I mean, yes, slavery was a big deal and it was a part of it, but this was about preserving this central authority, nothing else. And it was such a convenient way of saying, and then, you know, it's not like I reject that the Civil War brought an end to slavery. It just created a new kind of slavery. You know, but of course we don't want to talk about that, you know. So I am able, people will say, well, what about the Constitution? And I'm like, well, listen.
It makes good toilet paper.
So there were some great ideas and some great principles there, certainly. It's essentially not been worth the paper it was written on since about 1798. You know, I mean, there was about 10 years there that it really, you know, kind of maybe did what it said it was going to do. But I don't know if y'all have looked around much in 2020, but that Constitution is just about worthless. You know, look at your governor. You know, all these states have constitutions. But so one of you said this earlier, and I meant to interject it, but we hear now, well, speech is violence, you know.
That was my straw man way to debunk pacifism. Speech is violence, and I'm talking to a pacifist. I win.
Yeah. We're in such a strange, I still think exciting. I'm still incredibly optimistic going forward. I see a lot of stupidity going around. I see a lot of angst and fear. But I'm sure there are people that would make the case that not wearing your mask, well, you can't be a pacifist if you're not wearing your mask. You can't be a pacifist if you've opened your business during the pandemic. You can't be, you know, they want to take these extremes, and it's the same sort of philosophy that leads to this foreign policy. They want to call it peace, but all it does is lead to war. You know, you have in your mind, of course, you've assigned the state, of course, this duty to enforce these measures and these guidelines. And then when I say, yeah, but that's violence too, so I'm just not going to participate. Well, how dare you? You know, so it all ends up circling back and circling back and circling back. But when you look at, you know, the whole thing, I created a TikTok account this morning because Trump wants to ban it, and I figured I'd go ahead and just create one because all of my neocon friends are very happy that Trump wants to ban something that they don't understand. You know, I don't know what TikTok is, but by God, he's going to get rid of it.
Are we banning clocks? No.
Right. I keep thinking about that lady in the Hunger Games. TikTok.
Oh God.
But people, the state, you know, in a lot of this whole conversation from the beginning to now, you take the state and someone who has a monopoly on violence out of this, about 90% of the problem goes away, you know.
Right.
Because
too, as far as, sorry, I'm totally interrupting you, but as far as like what we're doing in the world to make it more peaceful, if we got rid of the state and everyone had economic freedom, like violence significantly is tied to poverty. And so if we had the state out of the way so people could run businesses and have economic freedom and have increased prosperity, that would do a ton to decrease violence.
Yeah, well, and I believe 100% that my safety, the fact, as I said before, the chances of my home being invaded are so infinitesimally small. Why is that? Good market, good economic conditions. There's not enough desperate people. There are some, but dude, I still know people around here don't lock their doors at night. You know, and then there's others that get on the community Facebook group every time somebody drives by my house. Oh my God, there's a red Chevrolet pickup truck. I've never seen it before. Somebody call the cops, and it's there because they're so on edge. They're just watching the news all the time. But that economic condition came from the market, not from the state, in spite of the state.
Absolutely.
And I forget which one of you said it earlier that the state is what makes war possible, or something along those lines. And I mean, it really is true. I think it was World War I where I heard the statistic was in reference to, where it was like if two things. One, before I say that, it would be very hard to wage war without two things: taxation and the ability to print money, which are things only states can do. Because if you have to gain money voluntarily to fund a war, that's hard. There's going to be a heavy burden of proof on you to show everyone that, like, A, the war is just, and B, that you're using their money properly to, again, because like people don't want to just, people only have so much wealth and resources to give. So they're going to be like, okay, well, if this war is hypothetically just, we want to end it as efficiently as possible, not just keep throwing money and boots on the ground like that's going to fix it. So that would make war much harder to wage. And then B, to be honest, not much war is funded by tax dollars anymore. It's just money that's printed. And that's part of the reasons why people got off the gold standard in the first place in America, was because if we had to fight World War I on the gold reserves alone at that time, it would have ended in 6 months. We would have been out of money. So it's like, in order to continue the military industrial complex and to maintain the empire, you have to, to wage the wars we're waging. You can't do that in a stateless society. You just can't, because, printed money, fiat money or currency in a stateless society has no value. You're not going to be able to employ an army of that scale or produce weapons of that scale. It's just impossible. And
it creates artificial markets.
Right, that too.
You can always fall back in the ditch of evil. Oh, it's evil. It's evil. It's evil. Yeah, but that's an oversimplification.
Not to mention all the enemies we have. It's like, I don't know if you ever watched Dave Smith, but he said it best. I love quoting him. He's like, if you want to know who America's enemies will be 10 years from now, look at who we're funding and siding with today. It's just like, it literally is just, we set someone up to fight them 10 years later. We always make sure there's a boogeyman to fight so that, they can, keep people thinking that, oh my God, if we didn't have the state, we would just be getting, attacked all the time by these terrorists. The only reason they hate us is because of our freedoms, right?
Right. Well, when you have such a significant part of the economy that is wrapped up in building bullets, tanks, planes, and bombs, well, you can't store all that stuff. You got to use it. And so you've got to have somebody to use it on. And so you just, which I think it's brilliant that throughout American history, well, it was the Indians and the French and then this country and that country, and they finally figured out, wait a minute, if we wage war against a country, we'll eventually win. We need to wage war against a tactic. Now we'll never run out of stuff. Osama bin Laden was our buddy. I mean, he was our friend. The Mujahideen were, that was our friend to help push out the Russians. And then we turned around and stabbed them in the back, and surprise, it pissed them off, and then somebody made the genius idea of start dropping American bases on the Islamic Holy Land. That was a great decision, and it just, the escalation continued. And I had this crazy little sidebar here. I had this crazy experience where I met a couple of Muslim guys at a trucking company. We're having a conversation. One grew up in Israel, one grew up in Cairo. And I said, hey guys, while I've got you here, I'm just curious about something, because I'm sure you would rather me get my information on Islam from you rather than Fox News. What about this caliphate and this Messiah y'all are waiting on? Who is that? Dude goes, Jesus. Hang, who? And he goes, we're Jesus is the Messiah. We're waiting on Jesus to come back and lead Muhammad into the, and I'm like, I never heard that on Fox News. Glenn Beck did not do a good job of articulating that particular point of Islamic theology to me. And so we're back to humanizing people, and I'm like, wait a minute. What would I do? Of course, this is Ron Paul's fault. What would I do if somebody occupied the United States? What would I do if somebody started dropping bombs in the next county? What would I do? I would probably be pretty pissed off about that, and then I would probably
look at how pissed off all the MAGA hat wearing Trump people are just at the idea of the thought that there's a bunch of foreigners that are invading our country that are going to make them like they're ready to bomb, shoot people down at the border just at the threat of foreign invasion, let alone like how they would act if people were actively, like, an actual outside state was occupying America. They would be, they would probably be more violent than a lot of, because predominantly a lot of the Muslims and Arabs in the Middle East are peaceful. They're just kind of hoping, hey, can you stop bombing us? Like, that would be great.
There's a billion people. There's a billion Muslims on this planet. If they were all terrorists, we'd all be dead by now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And what did they do with all the people in the migrant caravan? Like, did they all just stop one day and like, yeah, we're gonna throw a stake in the ground here? They just disappeared.
They evaporated. Poof. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, dude. It's so crazy because it doesn't matter if you're talking about politics, you're talking about faith, you're talking about any of these issues. If I look at somebody and say, yeah, but I'm not scared. Well, you have to be. No. I'm sorry. I don't watch Fox News and CNN, so I don't get the same programming that you do. And the people with TikTok. Well, I don't know what it is. I don't know why he's going to ban it, but I'm glad he's doing it. Are you serious?
But even if like let's take it from a different angle here. Let's say that the threats of China or the Middle East were, on any level, like, legitimate. We should be scared. Employing the United States state to be a solution to these problems is a short-sighted endeavor, because the state actions of, again, like, if these were legitimate enemies that we had to be afraid of, using a socialist mechanism of the state to try to effectively solve problems, I think history shows them too great that the state can't make it worse.
Yeah. Well, and isn't it, I don't know, ironic that a country like the United States that has been the most prolific spy in the history of man are suddenly upset at the idea that China may be spying on them. I'm thinking, y'all, the NSA has been spying on us for 2 decades, and the patriots are completely silent. But the Chinese may be, they may be using TikTok, and get rid of it. Oh my God, and I'm like, y'all, but you try to show them Edward Snowden, you try to show them Manning, the people that what's the funny line? What happens when you get caught spying on the government? You go to jail. What happens when the government you go to jail? Either way, I just screwed that up really bad. But what happens when you get caught? You go to jail. What happens when they get caught? You go to jail. They're in these executive orders. To me, are the legislative branch of the state has allowed that to go on for so long because it absolves them of all responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
They can say, It wasn't us. It was him. And of course, he's gone now. So vote for us. We didn't have anything to do with it. It was that guy, and then they continue that force. And I said this morning to somebody, stop giving Republicans power Democrats shouldn't have, and stop giving Democrats power that Republicans shouldn't have. We wouldn't be in this mess right now. I'm not against the idea of a constitutional republic, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the idea of a constitutional republic. The problem is when you give it power and you, the people, don't. You just sit back and say, oh, well, hey, we created a constitutional republic. Everything's good now. So I'm just going to ignore everything they do. And so that's why anarchy was so attractive to me, because I can say, okay, well, I'm not responsible for them. I'm responsible for me. And I'm responsible for my kids. I have authority over them because I'm responsible for them. And at some point,
it's such a self-defeating argument, the idea that when you need a government and you define government as we need people to have special power and rights over other people to keep peace because people are flawed, so because people are evil, we need to give some people power over other people. It's it just seems a little backwards to me. It's if people are already flawed and then you're going to take a certain group of people and elevate them to have more power over the rest of people. It's how are you going to make sure those people, do you think that only good people are going to run for office? Because human nature and psychology would probably say that the people most attracted to those positions are the people who have the most nefarious of intentions, because good-hearted people don't really have a desire to tell people what to do. They don't. Right. It's you just want to live your life and be left alone. You don't want to get in people's business. And if you do, and then there's an apparatus that lets you have that power over people, that's how you end up in the situation we're in now. So the whole idea of is a constitutional republic or some kind of governing system okay? The real criticism the anarchist gives is that any system that gives a group of people special rights and powers is immoral. If you have some kind of voluntary governance, like a church body is a type of a governing body. And there's nothing wrong with humans voluntarily organizing and operating within those small bodies. But even though there might be leadership, my pastor doesn't have powers and rights that I don't have. You know what I mean? It's we're all equals in the sense of our rights and power, and there's just a hierarchy of leadership and authority that you consent to. It's completely different than the idea that there should be people with special rights and powers over other people that you don't have consent to. Right. Because the other thing is if you want to have that voluntarily, it's the term is an incorporated city or community, covenant communities, where it's it's kind of a micro government. It's but you're free to leave and you can't coercively bring people into it. I'm a little weary of that, but that's still a lot different than what we have today, which is just hey, we drew a line on the map here and this is the United States of America. And if you are born here, then, you're subject to this rule and you have no consent or say otherwise.
Well, one of the points of the minarchist, is some level of allowable government. Okay. The mayor of my hometown, I know where he lives, so if he needs tarred and feathered, I have access. I don't have access to the governor, but I know where that guy lives. I'm outside the incorporated area. So I'm in a position where, there's a county, what do you call it? Not council. Anyway, the little county government, county commission. Mm-hmm. They have certain powers but they've got to get the deputies to go out, and you've got 30 deputies for 70,000 people, but in that city, you have a smaller concentration of people, and you have the more densely populated they are, the more the idea that they have to be regulated even tighter. But in that case, at least you can go to the mayor's house and say, "Hey, buddy, we're done with you." If he oversteps his bounds, but the president and these far away people, that to me is where either the founders didn't do a good enough job outlining that this central authority was supposed to be very small, and we're not supposed to be kings and rulers from far away, because it's like they defeated air finger quotes there, they defeated a far away ruler and replaced him with a far away ruler. People can make the argument that, well, the founders just they could never have seen, and maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't have the ability to see that.
No, I think a lot of them did, and did so with much more nefarious intentions than some people realize. Because
I'm starting to get there.
Yeah,
I really am.
Look into George Washington, the myth and the mythos around George Washington. When you actually study the facts of his life, it's really illuminating.
I think it goes back to anybody who wants power like that definitely shouldn't have it.
Yeah. Like I said, good people don't really have a desire to tell other people what to do. It's just, that's been my experience, at least. It's like, and anytime you have this, even if we want to say the founding fathers had good intentions, they were definitely short-sighted, because if you have a centralized power, you're elevating people to have special rights and powers over others, and that's just, you can't. Though again, that's the whole idea of what we have. It's like, we just need to elect better people and elect the right people, and I don't know how many election cycles we have to go through to see how that doesn't work, and it's just all coming back down to this. I said this in a conversation I did with someone on a podcast a couple weeks ago. I was like, listen, it's like, I'm just fundamentally opposed to the idea that I have to choose between the lesser of two evils all the time. I was like, we've been doing this whole the lesser of two evils thing for, a couple centuries now, just in American history, a lot longer in world history. I don't see how choosing the lesser of two evils results in a decrease of evil. It never does. It just keeps lobbying from one set of potential rulers to the other ones, and there's really not a whole lot on difference on paper when you really spell it out.
Well, y'all, we've gone about an hour and a half. Do y'all have any closing thoughts? Anything left you want to drive home on? I've looked at some of the comments, and it's like, well, this isn't really a discussion on pacifism. And I'm like,
well, no, because it ended up not being too much, because I couldn't find a whole lot where Abby and I disagreed. I could have maybe pushed a little harder, but I couldn't find many openings except things that would be nitpicking, and I didn't really want to have an hour and a half discussion over nitpicking.
Well, isn't essentially the foundation here that in when you accept your identity in Christ as a son of God, you don't need the violence as much. You just don't. Again, it's different first world versus third world. And there's people on this planet that got a whole lot bigger problems than I do, because I live in a first world area with a great economy. But I no longer desire that retribution. Like someone was saying, I know people that are looking forward to it. Yeah, come break in my house. I can't wait to kill somebody.
Yeah, it's just not. It's just not Christ-like. Jesus says, that you should not seek vengeance, and there's a difference between defense, like someone's actively trying to hurt you, and you're trying to just stop the violence that's happening towards you or someone around you, versus someone wronged me and I'm going to now go seek vengeance. If you want to talk about seeking justice, and so, like I said earlier, if you want to, I do think as long as we're here on earth, there needs to be some kind of legal system of resolving conflicts between people, mainly over property disputes. Like, I think
Yeah.
there's going to be some form of that always exists, and it might have to at certain times employ certain amounts of force to handle with the really violent evildoers. I do think that there would be a lot less of that if we had a privatized system versus the state system, with all the things that perpetuate poverty and violence. Because it's a vicious cycle, because there's the whole chicken and egg thing. Does poverty lead to violence, or does violence lead to poverty? To me, it's both. It is a vicious circle of one leading to the other, feeding into the other. And the state perpetuates poverty, and it perpetuates criminal activity. And so, you got to do away with the state to fix that problem. I mean, my only, I would, as Abby is presenting it, identify myself as a pacifist. If you define pacifism as seeking peaceful solutions, all the time, whenever possible, seeking to prevent situations from escalating into violence as much as it depends on you, I'm a pacifist. If there are some more extreme, if there are some extreme pacifists that have something against the other, like the little tiny things I mentioned, like some kind of legal system that handles the, property disputes and the violent actions of people who are, committing violence, there might be more to discuss there. But to me, it just seems like they're the two different topics. There's personally how we act in the world, and then there's, while we're on this world, there are societal mechanisms of organization, and those are kind of different. And ultimately, even just being on anti-war alone, I think 90% of the population would identify me as a pacifist, But yeah, I mean, this was never like, if someone came here hoping to see me talk about how we need to, go shoot people in the Middle East or bomb people in the Middle East to protect our freedoms, and, I'm sorry to disappoint you. That's
Well, one thing there is a lot of truth though in, right? There's one thing that a bully understands, and that's a bloody nose. Sure. There is a line between someone that continues to push and harass, and just one little good pop in the nose, be like, oh, I've never felt one of those before. That sucks. Yeah. You want another one? Because I saw that growing up. One of my oldest friends was overweight, and kids would, pick on him and make fun of him. And there's this one kid that was just relentless. And he tried to turn the other cheek thing, and I watched one day that he just grabbed a hold of both of this kid's ears and introduced this kid's nose to his kneecap. And man, their relationship was eternally transformed.
I had a similar story from personally. When I was a junior in high school, was walking out of class one day, and I felt something hit my leg hard, and turned around, and it was a girl. I was like, I don't know how old she was, but she was in high school. So, somewhere between 14 and 17. And I'd seen her around before, and she was, I don't know her story. She had some kind of disability where she often had a teacher aide with her, and I had seen her a lot in classes like that. Didn't really know her personally, but she was on the ground, had hit me, and I was like, what happened? And her and another person next to her pointed to this guy and said he pushed her down. And, I won't say how I handled it was perfect or without maybe some sinful retributive attitude, but, I went up to the guy and tried for about 3 seconds to talk to him and asked, like, what is your deal? Why did you do that? And then he kept walking, kind of ignored me and laughed. And so, yeah, I picked him up. I threw him against the locker, and I bloodied his nose, like, quite literally. And I don't know. Could I have handled that differently? Yes. And looking back, maybe there were some responses that maybe would have led to more productive outcomes. I do also kind of understand what you're talking about, which is like, if someone does an evil action and someone responds to them like that, that might definitely discourage them from doing similar things in the future. But at the same time, there's also probably room to say that might just make them more bitter and more angry, and that might worsen the problem. I don't know. I never, there's no way for me to follow up and see the long-term consequences of my actions there. But if I was an adult seeing that situation today now, I'm certainly not going to say, well, get your gun out and threaten the guy. I think you need to deal with things proportionally and level-headed. And I think now what I would do is I would come up to him and I would just ask, what happened to you, man? Why are you so broken? And what has happened in your life that has led you to think that this is acceptable behavior? Does this make you feel good about yourself? And, and then, say, listen, I think this comes from a place of low self-confidence, low self-esteem, and you probably have a low view of yourself. And I just want to let you know that, maybe you've done some bad things in your life, and maybe you have a low view of yourself and you don't think that you have any self-worth, but that is not what God thinks of you. And that is not what Jesus thinks of you. And have you, if you don't know the story of the gospel and you don't know the story of what Jesus did for you, I'd like to share it with you. To me, that's a much better response. And I think that kind of crystallizes what Abby and I are talking about, which is there's a difference between situations of life and death or criminal activity that needs to be dealt with in some manner, and how we deal with people who are being bullies in the world in ways that aren't life and death and that aren't egregious criminal activity. And our heart should be to bring the kingdom and to bring Christ into everything as much as we can. And we're going to fail at times and fall short, but that should be our heart and our goal.
Yes, I love that. I love that you ended up there, because I think that's so true. And with anybody who would do anything, it's coming from a place of hurt. And if we can bring in the kingdom, that's a much better situation where if you bloody the bully's nose, maybe that makes him too afraid to act out on whatever's going on inside of him internally. But it's not healing his heart, and it's not getting the heart of the matter. Right. And it might be to where he's like, okay, I'm not going to do that in public, but once I get a girlfriend, I'm sure going to beat her up when nobody's watching, that kind of stuff. So I just think we have to keep that bigger picture in mind. And I think as Christians, I think you mentioned this, that we have to be looking at justice from a perspective of it being restorative rather than from retribution. And then I think that's another thing where having the state, it puts a lot of confusion and muddiness in the water, because in our culture, the state is accepted. It's accepted that their violence is good, other violence is bad. And I think when you're kind of have that conflict of well, how do I identify when it's the good violence and authority versus the bad, where I think we have to look for, like you said, with the private justice system of markets, if it was more restoration, you stole from somebody and you have to pay them back, rather than you're being locked in a cage where terrible things happen to you for 3 years and your victim is paying taxes for you to stay there. I just think we err on the side of restoration rather than retribution.
Yeah, because there's a lot of studies that show that criminals that go through counseling and a response that's trying to rehabilitate them, to introduce them into, not that's just punishing them. And again, there's two steps. One, while there is violence being initiated against someone, I do believe we should act, and sometimes depending on what's going on, there's some level of force that might be necessary to stop the violence. But after that, and again, the force should be the minimal necessary. I am not someone who says that there aren't any situations where pulling a gun is unwarranted, but that is the last of the last resorts, and I agreed with what you said earlier, that if someone shot and killed someone in protecting themselves or someone else, it's not something to celebrate, holistically. We can say, oh, I'm glad this person's okay and that you rescued them, but also God, what a tragedy that this person got to this place where they were committing evil, and listen, I train in not just having a firearm and I shoot someone, but I also train in trying to use the firearm as a means to de-escalate, because, you know, it's like kind of a rattlesnake kind of like waving its tail like, hey, back up. And sometimes that can de-escalate a situation if you do it properly with the right training. And also, like, if you shoot someone, your heart shouldn't be, yeah, now they're dead. It should be like, you know, okay, I've disabled the violent act. Now I want to save their life. I'm going to call 911. I'm going to treat their wound. You know, you might like zip tie their hands together or something so they can't fight after they've been shot. Like, our goal should not be, let's just kill people. You know, to me, like, you know, because we didn't talk about guns too much. And to me, just to highlight that near the end, you know, guns are a tool. I think they have their place. But if putting your gun on your holster when you walk out the door is what makes you feel safe and secure, and you think that, you know, that is what gives you, I don't know, like, if leaving your home without your gun makes you feel like you're unsafe, I think that's a problem. And that is something that I've struggled with, and that I try to not, you know, live my life in a way where having a gun is my identity and whatnot. I do carry, but, you know, conceal carry, but I try to do so with, you know, a lot of training and intentionality, and with my heart not being, I want to use this. Again, it's like having a fire extinguisher. I never want to use that thing. You know what I mean? But I have it there just in case, because it might be needed at some point. But yeah, there's, to go back. No, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but just to quickly sum up, there is actions that are sometimes necessary to stop violence when it's happening, and it should be the least amount of force as possible. And you're not always going to get it right, because in the heat of the moment you can make bad choices. And in hindsight, I wish I could have done this. So we should try to prevent bad things from happening in the first place. But when they do happen, you know, like, end the violence. But then if you know, assuming the person's still alive, we should not be wishing that they're killed and locked up forever. We should be hoping that there is healing and redemption. Because, I mean, if we don't believe in healing and redemption and the power of the Holy Spirit and Christ to do that in people's lives, then, you know, I think that is somewhat, you know, you are taking away from the glory and the power and the goodness of God. Like, it is a form of doubt. I think it's a form of not having enough faith that, you know, when Jesus died on the cross, that, like, you know, did he die for people that were already good? No, he died for people that needed him. And, you know, that there's no limit. There was no limit assigned where it was like, I died for everyone except this category of people. And I think that is what Christian pacifism should look like. And if that is what it was across the board, you know, there's a few outliers out there people have talked to who have more extreme views than Abby, and we might still butt heads. But if what we've talked about here is Christian pacifism, then I'm on board. I have no problem with it.
I would just say, I think that's the big thing. There is no other. We're all children of God. We have to see each other in that light. And then what you said about, I think you might think showing a gun, it could de-escalate. I think it could potentially escalate. I think it
can go both ways.
This is my
definitely go both ways.
I have it as my last resort. I think you're still more likely to go there. And also, I don't per se have a problem with training with guns, and, like, I don't have a problem with people owning guns and knowing how to operate them and all that kind of stuff. But I just think if that's what you're focusing on, you're training to shoot a gun rather than training to how can I diffuse the situation in other ways. Like I said, I'm not going to judge somebody when they're in a situation that I haven't been in, but I just think it's really important that before you're ever in that situation, building the community where that kind of thing is less likely to happen.
Absolutely.
How are ways that I can stop this situation without needing any kind of force, especially deadly force? Can I zip tie a person without shooting them first? Like, maybe that would be a good idea. And then I think that goes back to, like, be strong and be fast. Like, God gave you your body as a gift. Take care of it. Use it to the most potential that it absolutely has. I mean, and especially, like, as a woman, yeah, you are at a disadvantage strength-wise, but I think, you know, not that many people put that much attention into being really strong. I think especially women, I'm totally getting off on a tangent. But I think women a lot of times view exercise as a means to be as small as possible rather than to take care of your body and be as strong as you can. And I think if you're in a situation where you're strong enough to hold somebody back or push them off of you, I think that's better than...
It's preferable if it's possible, but it's like, listen, like my wife's like 5'2", and even if she's really strong, if she's getting attacked by a guy who's like a foot taller than her, she's outweighed and outsized in a way that, even if she knew martial arts, she might not be able to effectively defend herself. And
agreed.
I mean, yeah,
that's like the solution. And if you're strong, nobody can ever mess with you, or But I'm just saying, if I'm just gonna say like, yeah, I'm never gonna work out, but I have a gun, so I don't need to. You know what I mean?
I agree, and I think I said that at the beginning. Like, a gun should not be an excuse to be lazy. It's like you shouldn't have a gun and be like, that's all I need to do. Like, no, like
or even mentally lazy, that I'm never gonna think of any solutions because I have a gun to rely on.
Absolutely.
If you're really loving your neighbor, if you're really loving your enemy, you're gonna like really try everything in your power to end situations that are in a healing way rather than...
Oh yeah, and I'm even open, and I've said this before. It's like, I might have a gun, I might be in a situation where I think I should use it, but if I feel the Holy Spirit telling me not to do it, I'm not going to do it. So, but I would rather, and again, I don't like carry it on me 100% of the time, but like I do generally have it on me because I would rather have the ability to use it and choose not to, than like be in a situation where I didn't have it, and maybe we could dispute how many situations a gun is absolutely needed in. I think that they exist, but that's kind of where that kind of debate gets into like so many like hypotheticals and what ifs, and it's really hard to objectively say you 100% could have done that, like gotten out of that situation without a gun, or vice versa. And I appreciate your heart where you're coming from well, I'm not really going to judge you if you did something, but I will encourage us to be, again, prevention is better than cure. And I 100% agree with that mindset. We want to be trying to prevent these things from happening. Just because you have a gun doesn't mean it's a good idea to go like put yourself in dangerous situations, whether you're a guy or a girl. You shouldn't be either looking to pick a fight, and just because my wife has a gun doesn't mean that suddenly it's like, okay, like, yeah, go clubbing with friends in a shady part of the city till late parts of the morning. And, and again, like, I'm not victim blaming. You don't deserve to be sexually assaulted if you are doing those things, but it's just that you're increasing your chances of those things happening. And we should be smart. We should be vigilant. We should not be careless and lazy and just be like, well, I have a gun now, so everything's good. And, if there's people in the gun community or libertarian community who, well, not if, I know there are people like that, and I do speak against it. Like, it's not an if. Like, I've seen people like that, so I know it exists. And I definitely distance myself from that. To me, a gun is just like, it's a tiny part of this entire thing.
And I would just say, I think if everyone's heart was exactly where you're at, I would be like completely 100% happy. So I think we're close enough to the same page where as long as you're trying to seek after those kingdom solutions, I think I'm happy with that.
Well, good. I'm glad.
One thing that needs to be brought into a lot of this is the law enforcement, de-escalation. They're not being taught that. They're being taught to go from zero to maximum force as fast and as hard as they can. And I just saw a video earlier of a guy that, somebody called the cops on a neighbor, and the guy opens his door, and within 3 seconds, he's dead. And that is a bigger conversation to be had than the one really that you guys are talking about on the self-defense, because you're much more likely to be killed by a cop than a terrorist.
Absolutely. And it's just, you highlighted one of the problems, which is poor training. And the other problem is that they are basically legally shielded from consequences, which is the opposite of what you want. Like, if you're going to promote a culture of gun ownership and responsible gun ownership and self-defense, even then it's like, and these are conversations that responsible gun people in the gun community have, which is like, listen, like, you can't be Wild West cowboy, like, or like a good example is like that. I'm terrible with name pronunciation, but a month or so ago it was like Ahmaud Arbery, Ahmaud Arbery, and the botched citizens arrest. Is like, I by no means approve of, and actually I would condemn the actions of those two gun owners and what they did. Like, someone strolling through your house, even if they took something, does not justify you chasing him down with guns and blocking him off. And, it's like that was just totally 100% uncalled for, I think, on legal grounds, and ethics, and especially Christian ethics. Like, there's no reason to act like that at all. And police, are the ones that usually act like that, though, because they're legally shielded from consequences, and they are poorly trained. Whereas, I know a lot of gun owners who are much more trained than your average police officer in terms of not only like accuracy with a gun, but more like being careful on how you present it, knowing what situations it's warranted in, how to present it, and how to avoid shooting it in the first place. Because, what people don't realize, and this is some good info to put out there for people who might be like gun owners, like, you don't realize that, like, if you shoot someone in self-defense, it's not like immediately self-evident the police show up and go, oh, self-defense, you're off the hook, and like the police leave. No, like, that can really ruin your life for the next like year to 2 years, because, like, although they presume you're innocent until proven guilty, they're still likely going to bring charges against you and going to hash it out in court, and that's going to cost you tons of money and time and heartache, on top of also the spiritual consequences that you're going to have to deal with if you actually killed someone. So it's like, I don't take any of this stuff lightly. I really don't. And I think people generally don't, because if you're going to be held responsible for your actions and you initiate gun ownership from a perspective of training yourself and being mindful of all these things, you're going to see a society where gun violence rapidly decreases compared to what the state does with the police and law enforcement.
I think also with the training of police, not just like how to operate a weapon or whatever, but mentally that they're fed, everyone's trying to kill you. Like, watch out, you have the most dangerous job in the world and everyone's trying to kill you at all times. Which I think is also a mindset that just civilians can have, which leads to a lot of issues where, like, well, anybody who tries to break into my house is trying to rape my children and I need to shoot them immediately. That kind of mindset, which, like Chris opened this up by saying, like, there's so small of a chance that anyone would break into my house in the first place, let alone that they wouldn't just take stuff and leave, but would be actually trying to harm me.
And if you're that worried about it, and listen, you might live in an area where that's maybe like I live in an area where I think that's a very low possibility, but not everyone lives in good areas. If you live in an area where you feel like you're at risk, or you're like like if you're a woman who lives alone and you're afraid, like, listen, I'm not going to tell you don't get a gun, but don't act like the gun is the final solution. You should be trying to, like, make your house as hard to break into as possible. And, those are all, we should prefer nonviolence. And if pacifism is just summed up as preferring and advocating for nonviolence as much as humanly possible, and when you have to use force, to use the smallest force possible, like, I don't see any reasonable argument against that, except people that are filled with either bigotry or hate.
I'm guilty of judging people that open carry with obnoxiously large weapons. I'll see some guy in the grocery store and he's got like a 45 Magnum and a 6-shooter and a big holster, and I'm like, "Hey, Wyatt Earp, you're not going to save the day, okay?" So
yeah.
Just
not
calm
to mention,
down.
it's like, the other thing to bring up is, like, with ballistics and stuff, like, you have to be careful not only that you don't shoot the gun before, like, as like a last resort, but like, you could miss and hit somebody else if you're in a crowded area. Like, you have to be really careful. Guns are a tool. They don't make you Superman or Batman. Like, you know, it's not like the movies where you hit every time. Like, you know, it is a tool. I don't mind people using it. I use it. I have it on me myself. But like, yeah, like don't act like you're, you know, you've suddenly gained superpowers and can solve any situation with the gun. Like that is the wrong mentality.
Or I think just the black and white mindset of I'm the good guy and the other person's the bad guy. I mean, like you really don't know the intentions of the other person's heart. And I think the risk of reacting too quickly or just the sight of your gun escalating the situation.
That's true. Like that is something that people warn about, like in mass shooting situations. If you're a concealed carry owner, you got to be careful about pulling your gun out to try to go after the mass shooter, because if police show up and you've got your gun out, they might just shoot you on sight. So you got to be really careful, like, you know, and, you know, there are situations where, sure, like if you're right next to the guy who's starting to open fire on a bunch of people and you have a gun on you, and listen, like this is, I don't want to present this argument and be like, you know, haha, pacifism debunked, because it's very rare that, like, mass shootings are, at least in the West, I think, rare. And it's even rarer that there are people who are armed in the perfect position to stop them. But, you know, when those situations happen, that is a situation where, like, yeah, if you're in a situation where you have a gun and there's a mass shooter, like, in front of you, but he's not facing you, and you can pull your gun out and stop him, I see very little reason that anyone would argue against you doing that. But if you're, like, 50 yards away, and there's a crowd of people and you see the mass shooter, that's a completely different story. And you need to proceed with caution. And, you know, and also, like, I've heard other people say, oh, if I was in Vegas during that shooting, I would have started, like, pulling my guns out and going to the situation. I'm like, no, that's a bad idea too, because you're more than likely going to end up shot by police, you know. And so, yeah, we need to.
We don't really know what happened in that situation.
That's true too. That's a different. That's a conversation for another day.
There's a rabbit hole. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think we've gone 2 hours. I think because we could go on probably another 2 hours. I think I would like to personally do another kind of roundtable on, you know, anarchist solutions to a lot of these kinds of issues. You know, there's a lot of different things that we can talk about and provide solutions for that don't involve violence, you know. And so that would be good to have. So, well, I had fun. I appreciate you guys doing this with me. We need to do it some more, because these conversations go by so quick, you know, and it doesn't seem like we've been sitting here for 2 hours. But I'm going to end it with that. We need to go back through the comments because there's been a lot of activity on there. So everybody, appreciate you watching, and we'll talk to you later. Okay. My daughter's getting ready to go to some kind of formal. My wife's blowing up my phone. Get your ass out of here.
Yeah, my wife's been like, how much longer? Because the baby's crying. So, yep, I'm gonna hop off. But yeah, thanks, Chris, for doing this, and thanks, Abby, for again being willing to chat about this. I think it went
a really good conversation.